Hi everyone, today we're going to learn a beginner version of Brown Eyed Girl by Van Morrison. We'll go through the chords used throughout the song so that we're familiar and comfortable playing them, and then move into how the song is played, step by step, verse by verse, nice and slow and together. Now before we start playing, the first thing you want to do is make sure that your guitar is in tune. I suggest using a digital tuner so that you can get your guitar in perfect tuning. Today's song, Brown Eyed Girl by Van Morrison, is played in standard tuning. Another important thing you should do before you play is make sure you cut your fingernails nice and short, otherwise it'll be difficult to push down onto the strings and you may get some unnecessary buzzing or muting of the strings. Now, we're going to move into naming or numbering our fingers. So, finger number 1 is going to be your index finger, finger number 2 is your middle finger, finger number 3 is your ring finger, and finger number 4 is your pinky. What we'll do is we'll use numbers for our fingers so that when I explain to you where to place your fingers for each chord, you'll understand what I mean. Okay, now let's move into tuning our guitar. Right now I'm currently tuned in standard tuning, so if you don't have access to a tuner, then you can tune off me. We'll start with our big E string. Here we go. Okay, now we'll move down to our A string. Okay, now we'll move down to our D string. And now the G string. And the B string. And finally our high E string. Okay, now that we're in tune, let's move into the song. Okay, Brown Eyed Girl revolves around 5 standard chords. A G, a C, a D, a D7, which is used in the bridge, and an E minor. Now let's go into those in detail. First one being the G.
The next chord, G, uses only 3 fingers. You can use whichever 3 fingers is most comfortable for you to complete the chord.
The first chord, G or G major, can be played in 2 different ways. A simple way is a 3-finger G, which is how I demonstrated it earlier, or a 4-finger G, which can be played like so. For today, we're going to use a 3-finger G, and we're going to use fingers number 2, 3, and 4. So what we'll do is we'll put finger number 2 onto the 2nd fret on the A string. Finger number 3 is going to go onto the 3rd fret on the big E string, and finger number 4 is going to come down here onto the high E string on the 3rd fret. Now our G chord should sound like this. Okay, now let's move into the C chord.
The next chord is a C chord. The C chord uses 3 fingers.
The C chord is also played with 3 fingers, but this time it's going to be fingers number 1, 2, and 3. Finger number 4 isn't going to do anything this time. So we'll start with finger number 3 position, which is going to be on the 3rd fret on the A string. Finger number 2 is going to go onto the 2nd fret on the D string. And finger number 1 is going to come down here onto the 1st fret of the B string. So like so, finger number 4 isn't doing anything, and our C chord should sound like this. Now move on to the next chord, the D chord.
The next chord, D, uses only 3 fingers.
The D chord uses 3 fingers as well, and is played on the highest 3 strings, the high E, the B, and the G string. So we're going to use fingers number 1, 2, and 3 for this chord. Finger number 1 is going to be placed onto the 2nd fret on the G string. Finger number 2 is going to be placed on the high E string on the 2nd fret. And then finger number 3 is going to come down here in between them onto the B string on the 3rd fret. And our D chord should sound like this. Now what I'd like you to do for this D chord is try and get into the habit of using your thumb up here so that your big E string doesn't get hit. You don't want to hear that. That's what you want. You just want to touch it. You don't want to push it down, just touch it. So that when you play your chord, you only actually play 5 of the strings instead of 6. Okay, next chord we'll learn is a D7.
The D7 chord is almost exactly like a D chord except it's upside down. It also uses 3 fingers.
The D7 chord is exactly like the D chord except for it's upside down. So instead of having a finger down here on the 3rd fret on the B, we need to put a finger onto the 1st fret on the B. So what I like to do is I like to still use my 1st finger on this B string on the 1st fret. So we'll leave that there. Fingers number 2 and 3 are going to go onto the 2nd fret on the G string for finger number 2. And then finger number 3 is going to come down here onto the 3rd fret onto the high E string. And it should look like this. And again, we're going to try and touch this E string if we can. If you can't, then eventually you'll get practice enough that you'll be able to. But our D7 chord should sound like so. It's kind of a sad sounding chord. Now the next chord we're going to learn is an E minor.
The next chord, E minor, is only using 2 fingers. Whichever 2 fingers is most comfortable for you is what you should use.
The final chord, E minor, uses only 2 fingers. We're going to use fingers number 1 and 2 for this chord. Finger number 1 is going to be placed onto the 2nd fret on the A string. Finger number 2 is going to be placed onto the 2nd fret on the D string. So with both of those down, we strum all 6 strings. An E minor chord should sound like this. Okay, now that we're all tuned and we've gone through our chords, let's learn how the song is played. Okay, now let's learn how the song is played. Now for this beginner version, we're going to skip the intro, which is a little bit more of an intermediate or advanced part of a song. So we're going to go right into the verse. Now the verse is comprised of initially 4 different chords, or 3 different chords I should say. He starts off on a G chord, then to a C chord, then back to the G, then back to a D. He does this 4 times. Now I'll play through it once at regular speed so that you know what it should sound like after we've practiced. Okay? On the count of 3, I'll go on my own. 1, 2, 3. That will go 2 more times. Okay, now let's play it nice and slow together. So we'll go G, C, G, D. Okay, now let's do that together, nice and slow, on the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Back to the G, to the D, back to the G, C, G, now to the D. Okay, now that's the first part of the verse. Now what he does is he plays that 4 times and then he goes into this next part, which I'll show you now. Okay, after he plays the first part with the G, C, G, D, he plays that 4 times. Then when he finishes on his last D chord, he actually goes back to a C. So he goes to a C, then to a D, then to a G again, and then this is where the E minor comes in. And then back to a C, and then a D, and then finally he ends off on the G chord. So you might want to write this down because this one's a lot of different changes. So again, we said C, D, G, E minor, C, D, and then finally back to the G. Okay, I'll play it at regular time so you know what it should sound like, and then we'll practice it together slowly. So I'll start on the C. 1, 2, 3. Okay, now let's practice that slower together. Okay, so now let's start that slower together. We'll start from the C, remember, to a D, then to the G, and then we have to put this E minor in there, then to a C, then to a D, and then back to the G to finish it off. Now let's play that nice and slow together. Starting on the C in 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. G, E minor, C, D, and finish it off with D, G. Okay, now if you're up to it, let's practice the whole first part and this part that we just learned and play it together. I'll show you once in regular time and then we'll play it back together nice and slow. Let's do that now. So on the count of 3 in regular time, we'll go G, C, G, D. I'm going to play that 4 times and then go into the C, D, G, E minor, C, D, and G part that we just learned. So on the count of 3, I'll start, I'll do it in my own time, and then we're going to come back and do it nice and slow together. 1, 2, 3. That's 2. G, D, one more time. G, C, back to the G, to the D. Now we're going to go to the C, to the D, to the G. Now to the E minor, to the C, the D, and to end it off on the G. Okay, now let's try that together, nice and slow. Okay, now let's do it nice and slow together. So we'll start at the G, C, G, D. We'll play that 4 times. And then after that we go to the C, D, G, E minor, C, D, and it off on the G. Okay, so on the count of 3, we'll start on the G. 1, 2, 3, G, to the C, back to the G, to a D, back to the G, to a C, G, to the D. That's 2 times. G, to the C, back to the G. Now to the D. One more time. To the G, to the C, to the G, to the D. Now we're going to go to the C, back to the D, to a G, then to the E minor, now to a C, to the D, ended off on the G. Okay, now go back and practice at your own. Practice again with me. Maybe try and play along with me doing the regular speed, as that'll be really good practice. Now we're going to move on to the bridge. Okay, so the bridge is when the D7 chord comes in. Now the D7 chord, if you remember, it's an upside down D chord. This is a D. This is a D7. Okay, now the way he goes into this is he says, "Do you remember when we used to sing?" And to get the timing for how long he stays on the D chord, that whole time he sings that line, he's staying on the D chord, on the D7 chord, I should say. I'm sorry. So I'll play it once, and then you can come in after, and we'll learn it together, nice and slow. Okay, here we go. You go to a G, then to a C, back to a D, then back to the D7, then a G again, to a C, G again, and then to a D7, and then, like always, he ends off on the G. Okay? So now let's do that together, nice and slow, and we'll start on the D7. Okay, so after he goes from the D7, he goes into a G chord again, and then to a C chord, then back to a G chord, and back to a D7. He plays that once, but then he plays the exact same thing again, but there's an extra G on the end. Okay? So again, that's G, C, G, D7. Okay? Now let's try that nice and slow together. And what I'll do, so that we remember when to switch from the first D7 to the first G, I'll talk out the lyrics so that we don't forget when to switch. Let's do that. Okay, so let's start on the D7, and I'll sing the lyrics just for this first part so that we know right when I finish singing, we're going to go from this D7 to our G chord, and then C, and then G, and then back to the D7. Okay? On the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do you remember when we used to sing? G, C, back to the G, to the D7, to G, to C, back to the G, now to the D7, and end it off on the G. Okay, let's do that one more time, just so I'm sure you've got it. So again, we'll start onto the D7. I'll sing the first line so that we know right when I finish that line, we go into that first G. Okay, on the count of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Do you remember when we used to sing? G, C, G, back to the D7, G, C, back to the G, then to the D7, the last one is the G. Alright, great. Now after he does this first bridge, he goes back into a verse, which was the G, C, G, D, 4 times, and then the C, D, G, E minor, back to the C again, and a D, and he finishes it off on a G. Okay? Now after he's done that verse, he does the bridge one more time, and then that's the end of the song. Now if you have any questions, don't hesitate to send me an email, and if you want to, I suggest you rewind and you go through the video again, and you practice with me, and practice on your own. Next thing you know, you'll be playing this song all by yourself. Okay guys, good luck, and thanks for watching.